Hi, I'm here with Antony Marcano, and we'll talk about Explore, Expand, Extract, or 3x thinking. Hello, Antony.
Hello, David. How are you?
Fine, thanks. And you?
Yeah, I'm really good, really good. Just happy to be here talking to you today about this idea.
Yeah, thanks for being here, and it's great that you found the time. So, let's talk about the basics first. What was hard for me to learn at first is that when I first tried to wrap my head around the concept of 3x was that you need a lot of background knowledge. But before we come to that, I think it's basically a thinking tool that allows us to think about payoff of a feature or product or idea in terms of its success. Maybe you want to talk about this a little bit first.
Yeah, I think the first thing is really just to sort of give credit where credit's due. 3x is obviously not my idea. It's not my idea. It's the idea of Kent Beck, and I discovered recently that not everybody knows who Kent Beck is. So for those who don't know, he was one of the co-creators of extreme programming and brought extreme programming, which contained many of the practices that we take for granted today on agile teams. Everything from user stories to test-driven development, continuous integration, and other such things came from extreme programming in the late 90s. And since then, he worked on various things, and one of the places he went to was Facebook. And he noticed that Facebook worked a little bit differently to a lot of companies. And as a result, certain things started to make more sense to him. And that culminated into him expressing these ideas in terms of 3x, which is the idea he came to. I could probably share my screen briefly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the idea was that in different phases of an idea or a feature or something, you need different ways of approaching it or of developing it further, right?
Yeah. So one of the favorite pieces that I read that he wrote was the product development triathlon, and he talked about it in terms of it's kind of a series of things that happen, like in a triathlon, where there's running, cycling, and swimming, not necessarily in that order. But whilst it's one event, there's three very different sets of rules going on and three very different sets of strengths and skills involved in each part of that process. And he kind of used this as a way of, as a metaphor, to get the point across that often we need a completely different mindset and a completely different approach, set of practices, culture, for these three very different stages of what I call the winning profile of a winning idea. And it can be any idea at any level, but for the purposes of this, let's just stick with the product development level of it all. So the idea is that when you're exploring, that's the point at which you're kind of doing a somewhat risky search for a viable return. So this is where we might experiment with an idea. Let's say it could be a feature idea. We try lots of different feature ideas until we find one that resonates with our customer base. Then suddenly everyone wants that feature, and then that may result in us, or that product, that may result in us having to throw infrastructure at it to cope with the loads and the demand. It may require that we throw manual processes at it to cope, things that are quite expensive just to maintain and survive that period of expansion. And the third stage is extract. So now the shape of the problem and solution are clear, and now it's much more about lowering the operational costs and extracting as much value as we can from that as possible. It was the guy on the right side here, that's Kent Beck. That was in his last few days at Facebook with me. And something that he said to me was that, 3x is something, it's a can't unsee concept. Once you see it everywhere. And honestly, I really did start to see it everywhere. So where it came from for him was the idea of it started with this podcast that he was listening to, and they were talking about convex investments and concave investments, and the idea being that some investments have an exponential return like this, and it takes time for them to mature, but then when they do, they mature big. And there are other investments that mature very rapidly from a given point in time, but then they'll level off. And what he realized was actually these two things actually fit together.
Yeah, but and the interesting thing is that the x-axis is not necessarily time, but that those ideas are linked to success. So payoff over success, not necessarily over time. Although success might be related to time.
It might be related to time, indeed. So, and that's the thing that he came to realize was that, the x-axis is success and the y-axis is payoff. So it's this is a distribution rather than a timeline. In that, while an idea is very successful, and that to him means there is some measure that it is valuable to your customer, and that there comes a point at which you start to realize how that value to your customer can be of value to you, and therefore bring about payoff. So when you have a growing success and growing payoff, you've got something that's proven now, and at this point you're more likely to be struggling to survive both demand externally for the products from your customers or for that feature, and a willingness to invest in it because it's generating a payoff as well. And as sort of the payoff levels out, maybe it's still getting more and more successful, but there's the payoff levels out. That's when you're really looking at extracting. And then again, because it's not a timeline, success is not infinite. It might stop here at this point here, and in which case you've both the growth in success and payoff essentially stops. However, continuing to operate that product or that feature may be expensive because of the choices you made whilst trying to survive during this rapid expansion of the idea. And now it's really about trying to find ways of making it cheaper to run, move it onto cheaper infrastructure, keep people interested by adding some new features. But now you've got a lot more to lose. So the way in which you would go about that would be in as low a risk way as possible. And what he said is he thinks that he came to realize that he thinks that it's extract type problems. It's the kind of extract type problems that people who are using more waterfall oriented processes were hoping to solve. Not necessarily that that it solves it, and not necessarily that it solves it in a very good way, but the intent behind the thinking for many sort of waterfall based ways of working was trying to solve that problem. And XP.
Yeah, it's also like in mass production or in how you operate factories. You have something that already works, and you have a proven payoff, and now you want to earn more by lowering your costs, right?
Yep. So that kind of factory mentality kind of almost makes sense when something gets to that point where it's just a standard staple thing. You've got a pretty straightforward process of how to make changes to it, and then you may invest in things that will then make it cheaper. And I've got a couple of examples of that. And what he kind of says is XP and other sort of agile methods are kind of somewhere around here. Aspects of XP help with eXplore, but not necessarily all of them. Aspects of XP can help with eXpand, and aspects of XP can help with eXtract, but on its own may not necessarily work that well in the way that he originally envisioned it in the eXtract space.
Yeah, like because Agile is a lot about doing experiments and failing quickly so that you can learn quickly and change direction if needed. This sounds more like better fitted to eXplore, where you try many things, than to eXtract, where basically you already did all the experiments before.
Well, yes and no, because still an element of it is, you know, I think XP still somewhat operates in the eXtract space where you may have an existing product. It's still valuable to experiment with feature ideas, for example. You may not necessarily know. So, for example, you may have a number of microservices running on one technology that's costing you lots of money in license fees and infrastructure, and you may find that if you rewrote those services in a different language that's maybe open source, that runs on cheaper cloud-based infrastructure, that at that point it might also be worth applying it there, because we're always learning. And I think this is one of the common misconceptions I think about Waterfall was kind of really addressing a problem from the 1960s when hardware was really expensive. So you couldn't iterate in the computer. It was too expensive to do that. So you had to iterate on the cheapest medium available, which at the time was paper. But now computers are like ridiculously cheap. So by comparison to the 1960s and 1970s, so we were able to iterate in the computer. And in fact, I've seen what I've essentially seen is because this particular model, and I say it's the profile of a winning idea, because it could be any idea. That idea could be, I've got this idea for how we could lower our infrastructure costs. You'd still want to explore by experimenting with that idea to see if it actually makes sense. If it then did make sense, you'd have demand for people wanting you to roll that out as far and wide as possible because it's saving you money. And then once it's all rolled out, then ongoing support and maintenance of it, you want that to become as inexpensive as possible. So interestingly, this particular curve seems to apply at a fractal level. So it can be at the product level, the product level, the infrastructure level, the feature level, even all the way down to what variable name should I use for this? Let's try this one. Nope, let's try this one. Now we've got a new metaphor that we're going to apply across this entire part of the code base. This is the thing.
I wanted to say that when you gave the example with the microservices, I mean the product might be in the extract phase, but switching to a different microservices stack might start a whole new curve like that inside the extract phase, right? That's what you've been talking a lot about, the fractal nature of 3x.
Yeah, well, I'd like to take credit for it, but again, that was another sort of Kent Beck realization. So I'm very much standing on the shoulder of giants here.
Yeah, of course.
I've
before we get into
with how to represent that pictorially, but I think we'll come back to that a bit later.
Yeah, I just wanted to say before we get more into the more advanced stuff like the fractal nature, maybe we should talk about what does it mean to me as a developer or product manager or CTO, or how can I learn from it or incorporate it into my thinking?
Well, first and foremost, I think it would take some time, I think, and a bit of reading and a bit of thinking about what it means, because it's hard to get the whole idea across here. And what we've talked about so far is really just scratching the surface of it. So before trying to use it or think to apply it in any way, definitely worth doing more reading on it. There's also plenty of online resources in terms of talks from Kent, where he tries to explain it in numerous different ways. And some talks from me also, where I've been trying to explain it as well. So first, to understand it, but
then I'm gonna link those resources in the description of this video, and let's talk more about learning it and applying it in practice in our next video. So maybe...
But it's worth probably saying, what's the benefit of it?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think for anyone, whether it's a CEO, middle manager, product manager, an engineering team, the benefit that it gives you is that it helps you recognize when the rules of the game have changed, and it helps you recognize when you need to change how you're playing the game. Because when you're exploring an idea and the speed of experimentation is key. And then it helps you recognize that, well, what I should be doing now is trying to find a way of experimenting with this, with all of as many different ideas as possible, as quickly as possible and safely, in order to find out what one of those ideas matters the most to my customers. And then you can continue to explore to find what the payoff is for you. But then you may not, if you keep experimenting, and one of your ideas is taking off and you haven't recognized that it's now left the explore phase and transitioned into the expand phase, and you're still playing by explore rules, your idea won't win, it won't survive, because you won't be trying to support that and enable that ongoing expansion. Similarly, while you're expanding and then it transitions to an extract phase and you're still trying to expand, then you're going to be playing by a different set of rules than the game itself, than the game that you're playing. And then recognize when you're in extract. And actually at the moment, what I'm noticing more than anything else is many large organizations are playing explore games with extract rules. So they're trying to minimize risk and develop ideas in ways that really are very applicable if you've already got a well-established concept in your products, and you're really just responding to feature requests at this point. There's nothing particularly innovative happening at that time. Then you're experimenting and you're essentially trying to keep costs down and so on, when actually at this point you should just be experimenting and expecting most of your ideas to go in the bin, and not having someone put together a 50-page business case to justify how much of a return this thing that they haven't even tried yet is going to give. Instead, just create enough space for people to experiment. So I think it's about understanding where your idea is, whether that's a product or a feature in its journey, and not trying to play the explore game with extract rules. Mm-hmm. That's one of the starting points of where it becomes beneficial.
Let me quickly recap to see if I understood everything correctly. We talked about how payoff of an idea or a product is linked to its success, and this link is highly unlinear. So it's an S-curve. Like you cannot have any payoff when you don't have success, and then the payoff doesn't immediately rise with success. Yeah, but when it rises, it does so big, and then it reaches a point where it can't rise any further, and then you're in a different phase.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think the key for me is that you're still, if you haven't found how this idea is a payoff for you, the producer, not the consumer of the idea, but the producer of the idea, then you're probably still exploring. But once it's clear that there is a payoff for you, and that payoff starts becoming a reality, then that's when you'll see this, find that you're in that expand phase.
And the interesting thing here is that you should probably play by different rules or apply different techniques, different management techniques, or different techniques for working together when you're in the explore phase than when you're in the expand phase and in the extract phase, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and then the big benefit of this thinking for teams, middle managers, and even C-level executives would be to have a thinking tool that helps you recognize when the rules of the game should change because you've now moved from eXplore to eXpand or from eXpand to eXtract?
Well, it's not even when they should change. It's recognizing when they have changed, but you're still playing by the old rules, and that is the trick, because you may not have a choice as to whether it transitioned. In fact, if it's a successful enough idea and it's a public-facing idea, the rate at which demand for that idea can increase can be quite sudden and dramatic. It could take a long time to find out what that idea is, but when you find it, it can be very sudden and dramatic. And a great story that I refer back to sometimes is for that is Angry Birds. Angry Birds, I think, was a 28th game that the developers had created. The previous ones weren't particularly a success, and each one of those was essentially an experiment. But somehow all of the learnings from that, not all of which they can explain exactly how it all came together, became Angry Birds, and then suddenly everyone wanted Angry Birds. And it was kind of whilst it took many years to get to that point, to the outside world they were an overnight success, and they no longer had a choice anymore because everybody wanted Angry Birds. So it's about recognizing when that's happened, and then changing how you play the game based on this completely new set of rules.
Okay, great. Let's talk about more about 3x thinking in practice in the next video. Just one more question: where can people find you on the internet?
Yep, I'm pretty easy to find. If you just Google my name, Antony Marcano, without the H in Antony, then it's pretty easy to find me. Find me by my full name on Twitter, and occasionally I might look at LinkedIn or my website, antonymarcano.com, or contact me via Riverglide, my consultancy, which is riverglide.com.
Okay, great, thanks. I'll also put links to all these sites in the notes or in the description of the video. And I'm David Tanzer. I am dtanzer on Twitter and on GitHub and basically everywhere. So also subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss the next video where we'll talk more about 3x thinking in practice.